A milestone moment or too little too late? The gavel going down on the annual UN Climate Summit with a final declaration that for the first time recognizes the need to transition away from fossil fuels. That was not a given when it was announced that the world's seventh largest oil producer would be hosting COP28 in Dubai. As always, these summits conclude with, at best, statements of intention. How much will this one matter? Other precepts out of Dubai include a tripling of renewables by the end of the decade. What are the alternatives to oil and coal? What status for natural gas, seen by some as a transition energy? New sources of power, though, won't be enough. What of humanity's centuries-old business model of more when it comes to producing and consuming stuff? The same politicians who hailed the final text as a breakthrough have also seen, here in Europe, for instance, the far right capitalize on a backlash against measures that they say punish the poor, pointing, for instance, to the quickly scrapped carbon tax that triggered France's Yellow Vest movement. To save the planet, what personal sacrifices can we demand of citizens? What collective measures are needed? Today in the France 24 debate, the final word on the UN Climate Summit. Joining us from COP28, Anabella Rosenberg, Senior Advisor on Just Transition at the Climate Action Network International. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for your invitation.
From Washington, Zarin Osho, Director of the India Program at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Good to see you again.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Activist and PhD researcher on green planning, Claire Lejeune is with us. How are you?
Hello, I'm well, thanks.
And France 24 environment editor Valérie de Kemp. How are things?
Hey, François.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Yeah, it took an all-nighter for Dubai to deliver its verdict. Peter O'Brien has more.
Transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. Those are the key words, the language that nearly 200 countries could agree upon. After 13 days of talks, the Emirati president of the COP28 summit declared the world had reached consensus on how to tackle climate change.
We have delivered a paradigm shift that has the potential to redefine our economies.
It's the first time the reduction of all fossil fuels has been mentioned in an agreement after almost 3 decades of climate talks.
For the first time in the history of our regime, the decision, supported by all nations of the world, calls for transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems so as to achieve net zero by 2050.
The text only applies to the use of oil, coal and gas in energy production, not industrial processes, and doesn't call for a phase out of the fuels, which account for around 3/4 of the emissions responsible for global warming. A bloc of small island states, which fear extinction from rising sea levels and more frequent natural disasters, said the text doesn't go far enough.
We have made an incremental advancements over business as usual, when what we really needed is an exponential step change in our actions and support.
The goal to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels was set in Paris 8 years ago. In hopes of meeting this, the deal in Dubai also sets targets for 2030, a tripling of renewable energy capacity, and for the world to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 43%.
Anabella Rosenberg, what was your feeling when you read that final statement?
I think, and apologize in advance for the voice. I mean, it has been a very, very tiring, almost 3 weeks of negotiations. I think like our first emotion, I guess, was some level of satisfaction for seeing the fossil fuel complex mentioned for the first time in a COP deal. That being said, I mean, we went through a pretty strong spiral of, I would say, lack of ambition. And this is mainly because the developed world has not really been willing to, one, put themselves at the forefront of that effort and saying clearly that they would phase out fossil fuels first or transition away from fossil fuel first. And second, because there has been no step towards funding that agreement. So whether this is historical or not, I think the future will tell us. I think it's very important to acknowledge that the fossil fuel industry was here in numbers, and they tried by all means to avoid any reference to other industry. So I think on one side, there is a certain level of satisfaction for us as activists to see those references there. But let's not lie to ourselves. I mean, that text is full of loopholes. There are many, many references that are extremely uncomfortable. And at this stage, with the current resources at the table, it's very unlikely that the developing world would be able to follow that path.
Yeah, so Anabella, maybe this is the question I should have also asked you at the outset. What is a COP summit all about? Because you're not going to have binding rules that you can enforce in 193 nations at any of these summits. What are realistic expectations out of such a summit?
You know, I think like we need. I think it's a very good question, because I think we all have very different expectations of what multilateralism can deliver. And I think there are two things. One, there is a group of people that believe in signals, and the UN being this place where signals are sent to governments, to the public, to markets. I am part of those that believe that also the UN is about setting standards. And I think we are still lacking the standards, the minimums, those things that will absolutely be done by everyone. That was also what the Paris Agreement, to a certain extent, was. They committed that they all would do these national determined contributions. You know, but I think there is an element that is quite important. The minister from Colombia in the closing plenary just said, you know what, we would all like it to be more ambitious. And at the same time, this reflects the consensus in the plenary. And I think this also shows the biggest problem, and at the same time, the beauty of it. If we really want to talk about difficult things, we cannot expect, these decisions to go easy, these decisions to be simple. And what is the alternative to multilateralism? It's basically local action, not aggregating ever to any scale.
Yeah, let me put this to you, Claire Lejeune. You heard there Anabella talking about the hard lobbying by the oil industry at this summit. Now, is that a bad news story because they're trying to slow down what you feel is essential? Or is it a good news story because it shows that actually these COP summits are more than a talk shop, that the stakes are high, and that this is an important place where the different players can converge?
Well, I think to understand if or if not this pledge is a historic one, we've got to put the process of the COPs in a bit of historical perspective. We've been having this process since 1995, and already back then the science was quite clear on the impact of fossil fuels on the climate. And so the fact that we're considering it a milestone today in 2023 to at last have fossil fuels mentioned in the final act.
So why did they relent after 28 summits?
Well, this shows that the lobbying power of the fossil industry, backed also by some governments who, the power they have was also, we let them have it. Governments let them have it also. So I think that power is not, we've seen it in a very visible way in this COP, because there's over 2,400, I think, lobbyists from the fossil industry that were present. But that power has been there all along these 30 years. And it's been shown that the fossil industry actually knew they had scientific...
So what made them bend?
I think there's been a lot of climate activism. There's been a lot of energy deployed by young people also to show that we will not have it, that we will not let our futures be stolen from us. So that puts some level of public pressure on governments, which in turn cannot so openly support things that are completely unrealistic if our aim is to preserve a livable planet. So I think that has had some impact. But once again, the wording of this final piece of this final decision is very weak regarding the constraints that are put on the fossil industry to actually phase out very quickly, which is what we need if we want to respect the commitment that was made in Paris 8 years ago.
Zaranosha, you agree it's weak wording?
Yes, I think it's extremely weak wording, but because both my co-panelists have given us a lot of reasons to understand why it is weak wording and transitioning away rather than phase out or phase, which should have been the ideal circumstance. I think what I would like to do is to also throw light slightly more on what are the different things that we have been able to achieve through the text under the GST, the Global Stock Take. The draft, obviously, the meetings went way over than they were initially scheduled to be. But there are some silver linings there. Too little, too late, I understand. But I think there is still chance for us, which is why we are consistently talking about keeping 1.5 degrees in sight, which has also been reiterated by Clause 28 of the GST final text. But if you see the Clause 28, subclause F, that gives me a lot of hope for what we might expect in the years to come. There is an explicit mention of the role of the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, which is methane explicitly mentioned there, which is useful for us to understand that there is a need for a dual strategy on mitigating climate. So CO2 in the longer run, again, explicitly mentioned 2050, with shorter near-term actions, fast actions on non-CO2 short-lived climate forces like methane, black carbon is
and
a huge
curbing methane emissions is one of those things you feel is easy to do.
It's not just what I feel, it is what the science tells us. There is now enough and more science to prove to us that even if we switched off all CO2 sources, emission sources tomorrow, we would still not meet the Paris Agreement goals. The only way to do it is by developing what I'm calling this dual strategy, where in the near term, you deal with the short-lived climate forces like methane, black carbon, and in the longer term, you deal with net zeros and carbon dioxide, along with technologies like carbon capture, to make sure that we're able to neutralize what the emissions look like. But again, the thing that we need to keep on reminding ourselves is that there are so many feedback and tipping points that kick in with every 0.1 degree centigrade in temperature rise. So if you're not able to do that in the near term mitigation, talking about end to fossil fuels and what happens in 2050 and 2070, like my country has put out, India, all of those are far-fetched. So what happens in this decade is going to be extremely decisive on what future it is that we look at. So there are some good things. Tripling of renewable energy is another one that comes to my mind, which is going to be a very powerful tool to define what it is that we are going to go ahead with. But of course, the open-ended questions there are, when you say transition away, what does that mean? Does that mean there's a cut in production? Does that mean there's a cut in consumption? What percentage of it? And one other subclause in clause 28 was on subsidies, which to me is a very interesting one, because the last data put out by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, says that we are at $8.2 trillion of subsidies on fossil fuels. There was a jump in the COVID years to make sure that the energy bills was sustained. But we're also looking at, increasing that number by 2030. So subsidies will be an interesting point to look forward from how, the decisions of the global stock take are interpreted in national law, which becomes law, which is not fluff. But that has to be reflected in the nationally determined contributions, which have to be.
Yeah, and it's the question of subsidies. It's great when you're at a climate summit. It's very hard to do politically. Zarin, what word do you have for our viewers, say, in Nigeria, where the new president has been trying to stamp out those subsidies?
So when I say that you need to stamp out subsidies, I do not mean that you shift the transfer or you transfer the burden of those costs on the end user, which is your consumer like you and I. Absolutely not. It is 100% the responsibility of the government to make sure that the transition comes in a very smooth manner, and it does not come. There should not be human cost to it. So when I say that subsidies need to slowly be weaned off of fossil fuels, what I mean by that is renewable energies are cost competitive. So when you have more and more expansion plans that are taking you towards a solar or wind or other renewable energy sources, then you can slowly energy mix away from fossil fuels or carbon-intensive fuels to more renewable energy sources, which is exactly what the rest of the world is trying to do, including India. We have historically been a coal-dependent state. We're now shifting away from coal to renewables and mostly solar. And the cost, the solar energy is cost competitive. It does not mean that I, as the end consumer, have to pay more.
All right, so we'll talk. We'll get back to that issue of subsidies, in particular when it comes to coal. First, though, and there's a lot of food for thought in what we just heard there from Zara and Valerie de Kim. Tripling of renewables by the end of the decade, getting rid of methane, trying to figure out what's the right mix in cutting production or cutting consumption of these fossil fuels, and as she just mentioned, the subsidies. So a lot to talk about. Something that Anabella Rosenberg mentioned at the outset, and that was something you reported on when you were in Dubai at the beginning of this COP28 summit, and that was this issue of climate finance, trying to get enough money in the kitty so that developing nations keep the carbon in the ground. And at the outset of the summit, a climate finance fund was announced for the leadership of oil and coal producer Colombia, which has been battered by extreme weather with El Niño's floods there these past 3 years. Climate change is a national security issue. It's a survival issue. Anabella Rosenberg earlier talking about the speech made by the environment minister at the close. She said it's not about a handout, but access to credit for financing its energy transition.
We are the fifth largest exporter of coal country, and also on oil. We need to make that economic transition, and it's not easy. I can tell you that not necessarily working on this transition has full international support as it should be. So my call for them will be to get into the table and let's talk about those economic consequences.
Valerie de Kemp, the Colombians saying, we're ready to do it. We're an oil and coal producer, but we're ready to do it. Are they outliers? Is that just the example we're giving, but it's the exception that proves the rule?
I mean, I think that Colombia, they've had a really interesting role and refreshing role in this.
We've talked a lot about Colombia since the beginning of this COP.
Because as you were saying, I think that they kind of represent maybe an example of a country that has oil revenue. They depend on that oil revenue to a certain extent. And they're saying we are willing to do it, but we need the help to do it. And I believe Susanna Mohammed, the environment minister, saying, we need that oil revenue because we need to pay our debts. And so we need that help in order to do that. And part of the issue that's been highlighted as one of the big loopholes of this text as well is the fact that, we have this language on fossil fuels, but there's no plan associated and no funding associated to help the developing countries and emerging economies move away from fossil fuels. And it's interesting that
But you had at the outset the president of the World Bank who has been put in charge, the World Bank's been put in charge of this kitty that you're supposed to have for that climate finance.
Yes, but it's again, I mean, these are pledges and announcements that are being made, but
there's no money in there yet.
There's no money, there's no plan. I mean, there's no plan for anybody at the moment, not just developing countries, but developed countries as well. And I think what was interesting to me over the last 2 weeks as well is, developing nations saying, we'd rather not have this fossil fuel phase out if it's not associated with the money. So again, I think this is something, it's the first break in the wall, but it will be one of the main issues as well going forward in the next COPs. Now that we have this idea that we need to transition away from fossil fuels, what's next?
Anabella, you at the outset, you said there's a problem for the developing world, and in that regard, what would you say is the takeaway from this summit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a problem for the developing world, but I think there is a confusion or sometimes, let's say, a simplification of the debate, as if the phase out of fossil fuels would be solved just by the deployment of renewable energy. I mean, that's how we are seeing it sometimes in the global north as an energy conversation. in part, this is an energy conversation. But from a developing country perspective, and for most of oil exporters or fossil fuel exporters, this is mainly a foreign currency issue. What Colombia was explaining, and we stick to Colombia because I think we should not forget how that government got into power. It was also a huge social movement, and there is no more social license for the fossil fuel industry in Colombia. So much their connections to violence, their connection to pollution, the connection to harassment to communities is strong. So this is not a sector that is loved in any country where it exploits, but it's somehow the only thing that is there. And the problem, going back to the economic conversation, is that when Colombia announced that they were going to go for a fossil fuel phase out, their interest rates grow, immediately. And basically, they cannot afford credit right now. And what they were saying, what President Petro was saying is, well, no one came to help us. So we were left on our own. And I think there is clearly an expectation, not only in terms of climate finance, but what is quite interesting also in the global stocktake decision is this the beginning of this conversation about how the climate regime connects to the need for financial reform elsewhere. And this is part of the Brazilian agenda for COP30. This is part of the conversations that they are going to be happening next year about the new quantified goal on finance. Again, if we want to go more ambitious, if we want to get real on this transition, we need to figure out how countries like Nigeria, how countries like Bolivia, can actually think and support communities and people.
So if you're Petro, if you're the president of Colombia, do you come out of this COP summit feeling more optimistic or more pessimistic?
I think you come saying, well, at least we started the conversation that is needed, and hopefully, people realize that if we want to get more ambitious, we need to make the enabling conditions happen. I'm not President Petro, I'm a part of civil society. And I guess our role is also to stand with an equity discussion, because otherwise we are in a downward spiral. I guess the last point, and you were referring to this in terms of the social justice element. I absolutely hear our colleague on fossil fuel subsidies and the expectation that their removal will not hit people. What we know is that governments have actually been kicked out of power when they've tried to remove fossil fuel subsidies. And this is because until now, climate policies have been run with an extremely neoliberal framework as well. And this is part of why we need to bring social justice to the way in which we do in climate action. And this is another outcome of this COP, is the launch of the Just Transition Work Program, which is supposed to address those elements of the absence of social justice when we are doing emission reductions, when we are doing adaptation, when we are thinking about alternative development models.
Claire Lejeune, we're going to have European elections in the spring throughout the continent. And the far right's going to be running against environmentalists. They're going to be saying, exactly picking up on the points that we've just heard, saying you're going to punish the working person. You're going to, forcing us to put in heat pumps that cost a lot, with putting ugly wind turbines in my backyard. You're basically going to punish working class people. Why don't you go build your wind turbines on expensive golf courses instead? Mm-hmm.
Yes, to answer this question, I think I'll start off with what's just been said on the fact that climate policies have been run up to now by mainly neoliberal governments and with a neoliberal approach, which basically focuses on the individual consumer, putting a huge amount of responsibility on this individual consumer, and then letting mainly the markets run their own life and handing a lot of power to big companies, etc. And the problem with this is that the individual consumer actually is built into a society, a system, and that as long as we don't have the public power to change the systems, the energy systems, the public transportation systems that surround every daily consuming action, then we won't be able to enable people to move towards a fossil-free style of life. And I'm saying this because the far-right agenda runs precisely on this, on the fact of because of these neoliberal agendas, people have been stripped of all sense of security. They have the feeling that their livelihoods have been fragilized, and so that resentment, that political resentment, the lack of trust also in political representation has fueled the far right. And so the upcoming European elections are going to be clearly determining for the way that the European Green New Deal is going to go down the road. We've seen how on biodiversity, the far right knows how to organize to potentially block out all environmental policies. But what we've got to do is to show how the green agenda can be a progressive, social justice-based agenda that can respond to the worries of people who feel downtrodden.
How do you tell them that it's not going to hit them in the pocketbook, for instance?
Well,
is it going to hit them in the pocketbook?
I think what we've got to say is not necessarily. It's a political choice. For example, the inflation in France is hit the middle and low-income class very hard because there hasn't been political action to control prices. And during that time, major companies have continued to, their margins have skyrocketed. And
but with a magic wand, if you get rid of all fossil fuels tomorrow morning, it's going to hit those lower and middle income people even harder because inflation will soar. I think precisely the role of a state is to organize things. So it's not like from one day to another. Right. It's rapid change that can be produced by investment in, for example, if you just take transportation, massive investments in public transportations. If you take heating, it's tackling the issue of poorly insulated housing. There's a number of means of action we can deploy to change the system in which people live and to make sure that when the phase-out actually happens, it doesn't impact the normal citizen. Right. The state has a role to play. You say the US-China rivalry, as you know, has intensified in recent years. On climate, though, Washington is encouraging more dialogue with Beijing, taking even a page out of its book, what with massive public backing of renewables. The Biden administration has put a lot of money into energy transition subsidies. Whenever projects like the offshore wind farm inaugurated off the shore of Long Island this month are enacted, there is pushback from local residents about it. Let me ask you, Valerie de Kemp. Again, it's the politics of the role of the state going forward. And there are those bemoaning the fact that the energy transition has turned into a trade war, they say, between the U.S., China, and Europe.
Well, you know, and to go back to what you were saying, and I think that usually when we talk about finance and the climate crisis, us at least who live in the West, we usually talk about finance and the climate, in the context of, developed world needs to give more finance to developing world. But I think that there's also the political reality that governments will also need to confront here in the West, confront the reality that, transitioning away from fossil fuels will also cost money for, us here in the West as well, helping. It's not just, as you were saying, something that's going to be resolved by the private sector. And at some point, they're going to have to put money on the table to help people, buy their electric cars, buy those heat pumps and renovate their homes. And so obviously, what you were saying, that there's this political reality of, governments being confronted, just like we saw in France a couple of years ago, raising fuel taxes. And then you have the Yellow Vest movement. Yes, that is a political reality, but there's also the political reality that they're going to have to put money on the table. And not just for, what's going to happen in other countries, but here as well.
Zaran Osho, there's at the same time, again, this is a multilateral decision agreeing to these pledges from nations around the globe at a time when multilateralism isn't doing all that well, to put it mildly. UN institutions have not had a good track record of late, with the fighting between superpowers. The question, when you hear the resentment directed at India, for instance, for doubling down on purchases of discounted Russian oil to fund its economic development, is that kicking the can down the road?
I don't think so. I think first and foremost, what we should understand, which has also been the line of argument for a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia and a lot of the other developing countries from the global south, is look at our socio-economic conditions and then let's try and make targets of what should and should not happen. India is a country with single-handedly the world's most ambitious renewable energy plans. Does that mean that we do not need fossil fuels in the near run? Absolutely do, because that is where we are. That is the reality of the world. I think what is important to understand is, and like my colleague just mentioned, there are going to be countries who are petrochemical countries. Their entire economies are based on the sale of fossil fuels, like the Middle East. You have the GCC, you have African nations, you have Latin American nations that are oil economies. The idea is, how do you then look at that reality of that country, juxtapose that along with the reality of those countries not being able to do very well financially, economically, and how do you sort of put those two realities together and come up with a transition plan that works for a country like that? So I think there's a lot of talk about what Claire said, about countries wanting to do things differently, how we should be looking at the reality of the capitalist world that we live in. I think this is something that has been echoed more than once by Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados on the Bridgetown Initiative. And that is something seriously to be taken into consideration when we're talking about COP. And I think more than COP, the meeting, I think it needs to be reflected in the negotiations and the agreements so far. So to give you an example on climate finance, we have actually made progress on the quantifiable goals, right? And we did have explicit numbers included in the final text of the global stocktake, where the number floated is 89.6 billion, if I'm not wrong, of the 100 billion that was promised annually. And the language then goes on to saying that we are going to be anticipating 100% replenishment of that particular fund. Where on one hand, that is the reality. On the other hand, the reality and the question to be asked is, why is it that the UAE is announcing a multi-trillion-dollar fund at the beginning of COP28 and having only been able to pool 700 million for loss and damage fund? The subsequent question to then ask is, what is the loss and damage fund? What is it going to assess? Who is going to give the money? The World Bank is now going to operationalize this fund. What does that mean? How do you assess loss and damage? What is the definition of loss and damage? Who is going to do these assessments? Those are the questions to ask, and keeping those questions in mind, the reality of the countries that we are dealing with. Right?
So that's still a work in progress. 2 years ago at COP26, nations agreed to a phase down of coal. For now, production is on the rise, both in China and India, where it's up nearly 50% in the past decade. Delhi's even planning for a revival of underground coal mining, tripling over the next 5 years. So says its coal ministry, Zaranosha. There's a ministry of coal in India. Again, I ask the question, it's a transition time for a country like India. How long does this transition last?
As long as the economics last. That's the simple answer to your question. So the minute you have more and more, so most of our energy, so there are a couple of things to look at. Our grid. We need our grid to be, the infrastructure of our grid to be upgraded. We currently do not have an upgraded grid, which is not capable on taking on 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. The first one is investments in the grid infrastructure. The second is we're also using coal, not only for energy purposes, but a lot of other things. So the other question to ask is, when we are looking at our energy mix and the energy consumption, where is the most of the consumption coming from? And if I can quote some, just general data to you, most of our peak demand for coal-fired power plants comes in the summer months when the temperatures are hitting 50 degrees centigrade and above in some parts of the country, where you are forced to use coal power so as to make sure that you do not face power outages. So one of the things to deal with that situation is to improve energy efficiency of air conditioning appliances. Now, while I say that, Government of India was also one of the first governments in the world to have something called as the RMI Global Cooling Price. They have tested along with Chinese and Japanese companies, Gree, Daikin, others, on what would air conditioning technology look like, which is 5x efficiency in the market, even in the best product available in the market.
So let me bring in Anabella Rosenberg on this. You take Zaran Osho's point that if you want a country like India to reduce its coal production, you need better air conditioners. You need a more different kind of, because they have a huge energy demand. It's the world's most populous nation now.
Yes, and you need many other things. You need also a social protection system that will take care of all the workers, including those in the informal economy in India that are living out of coal. And you need also to think about what is the alternative for some of the regions that are dependent there. But I think it's very important that we don't, focus only on coal. The importance of bringing all the fossil fuel story is that we also know that the developed world is actually increasing its investment in more exploration and exploitation of oil and gas. And I think it's relatively easy to point the finger to India, China, and a few developing countries that are still growing coal. The 4 countries that have been expanding the most fossil fuels are actually in the developed world. It's the US, it's UK, it's Australia, and Norway. So I think right now there's not a single country that we can say that is on the path to phasing out fossil fuels. There are indeed massive issues connected to finance, but there is also a lot of hypocrisy. And I guess this also connects to your other question about the social consensus for the transition, both in the developed world and in the developing world. Because right now, the general public is rather scared about what that transition could look like for them. And this is because repeatedly, decisions from governments have been to put the weight of this transition on those who have the least. And this is as much between North and South and as within countries. And I would just like to end with that idea that injustice is probably the feeling of injustice and probably the reality of injustice is one today of the biggest blockers of ambition. If people feel like once again, the polluters are not going to be asked to pay, if fossil fuel companies that have made incredible amount of benefits in the past 2 years, are not going to even be taxed to pay for that loss and damage fund and for the impacts they are having in the world. If the wealthy that today accumulate, and actually we know the statistics from the Oxfam report, the wealthiest 1% is actually responsible for more than 60% of the growth of emissions in the past 10 years. If those elements are not captured by public policy, we are going to continue to just follow these narratives of, here's the mean developing countries that continue to dig coal. I think the story is more complex. And at the core of it, there is this deep sense of injustice, both between countries and inside countries, that we need to address.
In both cases. So the final document at COP28, it recognizes that you need to be realistic. You need what are called transition energies, natural gas, and I guess what a lot of people here in France see as a silver bullet, nuclear power.
The agreement sets great ambitions for renewables and energy efficiency and mentions nuclear power for the first time while making room for energy sobriety. This is an unprecedented result which sends a strong signal to all stakeholders and the market.
Claire Lejeune, what's your religion when it comes to nuclear power, which does not emit CO2 as such, unless you're counting, of course, it's the transport of the uranium to the...
it's an issue on which I try very hard not to have a religion. But basically, the problem, if we are realistic with nuclear, is that the plants that they plan to develop, they will take decades to actually be on foot and working. So even if you take the targets in terms of CO2 cuts, etc., nuclear is not the best tool we have because of the time you need to actually develop this type of energy. Renewables, on the other hand...
But the French president made the argument that gone are the days when you built these giant reactors. Instead, he's going to build, I guess he didn't call them mini nuclear plants, but kind of.
And that brings us maybe to a second problem we have with nuclear plants is the risk of it. I mean, if we have an increasingly unstable planet with increasingly frequent heat waves, and we know heat waves sometimes stop the plants from functioning because they need to be cooled down, then if we're going to spread these all over the planet, then we've got a heightening of global risk, which is phenomenal. So in the choice of tools, of policy tools we have, in the choice of forms of energy we have, it's not a given that nuclear is the right bet to have in this situation. And also, I think the use and the implementation of nuclear power kind of makes you skip the importance of sobriety, of actually cutting the demand in energy. That should be the priority here.
So energy sobriety. Valérie de Kemp, objectively speaking, what you're hearing from Claire is a minority position, right, in France. And you can put aside what happened at Fukushima, the fighting that's going on around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant currently, and the nuclear waste issue.
I mean, yeah, nuclear power is not really a question in France. France being, the champion of nuclear energy here in Europe, we get more than 75% of our electricity from nuclear power plants. This argument, this nuclear renaissance, as Emmanuel Macron called it during this COP when he signed on to a pledge to triple nuclear power by 2050. I think that it's, for many people, nuclear power perhaps has emerged as a reassuring option in the sense that it's technology that is available. It's there. We know that it can produce a lot of energy. And especially we know that with plans and the urgency to electrify everything and anything that can be electrified, electricity needs will continue to go up. And so nuclear power, in a way, maybe comes up as a reassuring in the sense that, it's there and it can produce a lot of energy. But
here comes the but.
No, I mean, my but is to say, I'm kind of on the fence when it comes to nuclear power as well, because, we know that it does not emit greenhouse gas emissions. And, for public opinion, maybe 20, 30 years ago, it would have been unlikely to have nuclear power in a COP deal. But now, even after we've had Fukushima and all those concerns, maybe public opinion is more scared about the consequences of the climate crisis than, the potential of nuclear power plants. And so...
All right, a case of pick your druthers. We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. So much more to talk about coming out of this COP summit. I want to thank you very much, Valérie de Kemp. I want to thank as well Claire Lejeune, Anabella Rosenberg for joining us from Dubai, as well as Zarin Osho in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.